Good to see everybody out for Bible class tonight. We are on Cycle 3, Lesson 4. So I'm just going to start foregoing Cycle 3 because that's where we're going to be from here on out for the next 3 years. So I'm just going to say we're on listen this, that, or the other. Does anybody need a handout for the flood events? That's what we're going to be studying tonight. Okay. Tristan, mind helping us out? So if you just keep your hand up. I'm going to try to have those out a little sooner than I have been. I've only been putting them out a week ahead of time, and I'll try to also make mention of that to be announced so that everybody will remember to get them. So on your way out, we've got a handout for Lesson 5 in the back as well, so go ahead and be grabbing that. Remember, you can also access that on your phone in the app. If you go down to the 3-cycle approach, it's the bottom of the app on the left side. You can access all of the handouts that are available. And worst case scenario, you can at least have that if you don't have a hard copy. But I'll try to keep hard copies in the back. There is one out there for next week's, which is the scattering of the people. So go ahead and pick that up on your way out. And just that will allow you to be a little more prepared. The questions, I understand, the rudimentary. They're not intended to stump us really, but just to really help guide us through the text and to just kind of get everyone involved in the discussion. Posted on the back of those, there's discussion questions as well, which we're wanting to learn the story of the Bible, but also make application into our life. And so the discussion questions are going to cause us to probe a little more deeply into Scripture, particularly in regard to application. So there's going to be a couple of those on all of the handouts. And just that's just kind of help us work through the text and help you prepare. And you've been studying the Bible for a long time. That's really nothing more than just to aid in doing that. So we're going to begin here in just a few moments, but before we do, I'll ask Joel, if he will, to ask God's blessings on our study.
Looking at your story, your plan for our redemption. Father, we're so thankful for your patience with all mankind, with each of us individually and mankind over the years. We're for the plan of salvation that you have built before time began, and then we stand in amazement as we look at you working that out through different kingdoms and different times and different cultures. And we pray that as we go through this study tonight and as this study as a whole, that we would be strengthened, that we would better understand your will for our lives and better understand how to share that story with others. We pray that you be with the teachers tonight, both in here and in the back, that you would help them to present the things in a way that helps each of their students to grow so that they can grow closer to you. Father, we are so very mindful of how blessed we all are with material things, health, strength, freedoms, opportunities to glorify your name. We pray that you'd help us do that every day of our lives, and that we would serve you in such a way that you would take us home forever with you in heaven. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you, Joel. All right, it's been too long, and I'm going to start off by doing something I really don't want to do, primarily for my own embarrassment, but the good news is I'm going to drag you all along with me. So, all right, we're going to review the 17 time periods. So we've kind of got off track. We made that a priority in Cycle 2. I tried saying it 4 or 5 times today. I get mixed up, so we're all gonna try to say those together. 17 time periods. All right. Before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, the Exodus, wandering in the wilderness, invasion and conquest, Judges, United Kingdom, Judah alone, Judah in captivity, return from captivity, years of silence, life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. Well, that went a whole lot better than I expected it would. Y'all did pretty. We didn't quite have the volume, I think, that we normally do. So we're going to probably start trying to review that just before we begin each class. Because that is, this is a story, as Joel pointed out, and understanding and going through the Bible in this way we're really digging down into some of the details now in Cycle 3, but this will help us to kind of keep the big picture in front of us. And so, as you understand, these are the different periods where very significant events happen, and ideally we're able to place the stories and many of the narratives into individual sections of the 17, each of the 17 time periods. So tonight we're going to be covering the flood events, and just real quick, what chapters of the book of Genesis does the before the flood occur in? Anybody remember? Yeah, Genesis 1 through 5. What about the flood itself? Okay.
6 or 9.
Okay. The flood narrative itself is 6 through 8, but I believe the way Mr. Waldron's got it broken up, and we're kind of following his schedule for the sake of continuity. You know, we might could argue about some of the details. 6 through 8 is actually the flood, but 6 through 10 is the events that he uses to place into this specific section. Chapter 9, in fact, we're going to be going about halfway through chapter 9 tonight, and then next week we'll take the second half of chapter 9. Both of those involve Noah, though, and so for just the sake of our study, chapters 6 through 10 are the flood events. So just a real quick overview of where we're going to be going. Probably most of our time is going to be focused on Genesis chapter 6 and Genesis chapter 9. That's where the majorly significant events are taking place. But in chapter 6, we've got Noah being called to build an ark in preparation for the flood. In chapter 7, he and his family embark on the ark, and the flood covers the earth. In chapter 8, you have the flood subsiding and the disembarkment. And then in chapter 9, you have God's covenant with Noah and every living thing that he then makes. So we oftentimes think about Noah as a kid's story, maybe as a VBS. You know, that's a story you can take back to VBS. That's good for the kids. And certainly there's ways that you can teach the flood and its events on the level of children. But the flood is a story of sin. It is a story of grace and mercy, and it is a story of judgment. And so far from being a kid's story, if we kind of just look at it in that light, we miss some of the major elements of Scripture, such as sin and grace and mercy and judgment. And the flood foreshadows some very significant events that Jesus even refers to and the New Testament writers refer to. And we'll talk about those a little bit later on. Chapter 6 begins not so much with the flood. Depending on how you interpret the first 4 verses of chapter 6 may cause you to say why this text is there. It's debatable, some of the things that are said there, where we've got the marriage of the sons of God and the daughters of men. And I love examining and looking into things like that. Those kind of just off-road things, they're interesting for me, but we've got 2.5 chapters of major stuff that we've got to cover, so I'm not going to take us down that road. That'll just have to wait for another time. The 2 points we do want to observe from the first 4 verses of chapter 6 is, one, God announces the time frame of 120 years. From my understanding, there's debate as to what the 120 years is. Some people says, well, that's the new lifespan of man. Olin, what do you think about that?
Well, I used to think that too until I started really reading through the book, and I was like, okay, well, so I did a little bit of research, but it seems like it might actually just be the time frame between when God initiated the whole idea of the flood to when the flood actually was going to occur.
Yeah, I agree.
That's what I understood it.
Yeah, I would be of the same opinion as well. And like you, I thought before this was God saying, okay, 120 years, that's going to be the lifespan of man. Whenever you get past Noah, I mean, Noah lives to 950 years old, okay? And it does begin, as we're going to see, to taper off after that. However, this doesn't seem to be an indicator that mankind's going to live 120 years. Noah's going to say in Psalm 90 that man's going to live just on average 70 or 80 years. And so I'm of the persuasion that you are regarding the 120 years there. This is kind of the point in time in which God's saying, okay, humanity, you've got about 120 years left. And then, you know, the world's going to be destroyed with water. And Noah's going to spend 100 or so of that preparing the ark to protect and save him. So the 120 years is announced in the first 4 verses. And we're also introduced to the Nephilim. They are, for lack of a better term, they seem to be giants. And they pop up several times throughout the story of the Bible as well, but they're first mentioned here in Genesis chapter 6 in verse 4. So those are the primary things that we really want to take away from that rather than getting involved into exactly what may be happening here in this text. All right, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into our first question. Olin, if you want to do the questions, that's fine.
Why did God determine to destroy the earth with a flood? Man was wicked.
Yep. What kind of wicked we talking about here? Yeah.
Yep.
All right. So we're not talking about just mankind was kind of bad. Mankind's still wicked. you know? And sometimes I think we get in our mind like, could society get any worse than it did? I think it was worse in Noah's days. The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and I think verses 5 and 6, the end of verse 5 really describes the depth of pervasive wickedness. Every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. So we're not talking about a little bit bad. We're talking about the face of the earth was covered with wickedness, with the exception of this one family. Joel?
I just think verse 5, there's so many amplifiers, but the one that sticks out to me, you read a lot of stuff about intentionality and leadership and intentionality and decision making and things like that, and it's that every intention of the thought. So, at least for me, the message is it wasn't just they got into a really bad habit and it got out of control and got the better of them. It's very much I am choosing in a premeditated way to think and do evil things only continually. That just
Yeah, it'd be a bad state in which to live, and we'll see a little later. There's a specific sin that seems to be most pervasive among humanity at this point in time, and so you see the state of the wickedness of the world in verse 5, and you see God's sorrow at everything that's going on. We often think of God as being angered by sin, and certainly He is. Sin is an offense to God's holiness and to God's righteousness, and oftentimes that's the response you see whenever God speaks to an individual or speaks to a nation that is in sin to this degree. Okay. However, it's not the only thing that's highlighted here. In fact, that's not the emotion that's highlighted whenever we see God looking at humanity, what God wanted for humanity, what God planned for humanity, and then seeing the path that humanity has taken and the depth that the depravity has really filled the earth. We see here the sadness of God. And you could just hear the regret and the sorrow in His voice when He says, He says, I'm sorry that I've made man. And it said, it grieved Him to His heart. And so I think, God's sad because of sin. And what sin does, sin destroys. And it's going to bring judgment, it's going to bring death as well. And I also think God's sad because of what's going to happen. He knows what's going to happen in response to this. And I think that also caused great sorrow to the Lord. But the text doesn't leave us, with sorrow and sadness. In verse 8, there is a small ray of hope, in which there always is, even in the darkest times. Verse 8 of chapter 6, Noah found favor, or Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. So we're going to talk a little bit about Noah.
Can I go back on something real quick? I guess when you get the opportunity to do this, you kind of start digging some more. We're 6 chapters into the Bible, and we've already seen God's mercy and patience, even though He's bringing judgment. Like Adam and Eve, first sin, He was still grace. He still had mercy, and also He still had patience with them. Didn't take them off the face of the earth right then. He just took them out of the garden. Yeah. And then Cain and Abel, He could have killed Cain. He kept him alive. Just mercy. And it's just amazing to me, like, now He is destroying the whole earth, but yet He chose to still have a way for mankind to prevail.
Yeah,
through it all.
That's a good point. I mean, you said we're 6 chapters in, and you see sin, you see judgment, but you see grace and mercy in exceeding ways, and you see that in Cain and Abel, in the Cain and Abel narrative. You see that in the Adam and Eve narrative. You see that here very clearly in the flood narrative, because and yes, He's going to bring judgment down, but 120 years, right?
Yeah, He's still patient with it. He could have ended it sooner probably, but
certainly
He even gave Noah enough time to build an ark, get animals on it, get all the food in there and everything. So.
And not just Noah. You think if somebody else wanted to board that ark, you think He'd have kept them off? I mean, certainly not. No. The ark, as we're going to see, Noah wasn't just building the ark. It seems to me that there would be opportunities for others to get on that had they wanted to. But you look at the state of the earth in verse 5 that we've talked about. There's a reason that nobody ends on the ark except for Noah and his family. But you talk about patience. The Lord put up with the wickedness, that level of wickedness for 120 years, and all the while invited people to repent, in that time. So it's a good observation there. All right. Question 2.
How was Noah described in Genesis 6:9? Walked with God.
Okay. Yeah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. So those, I mean, that's that's quite the commendation from the Lord. There's a couple commendations that really stand out in Scripture to me of individuals, of men who lived. Noah's one of them. Job's another one in Job chapter 1 as he's being described to us. But it says he's righteous. That is, he walks according to God's standard. He is perfect. Obviously, that's blameless. This idea of, just no major charge could be against him. Obviously, not sinless, perfect. But he's above reproach in the way that he lived his life. And then he says he walked with God, and that's obviously a relational term that was used about who else? Yeah, Enoch, a very special man that we know of. Lauren?
Every intent of man was wicked. I mean, we've seen God wipe out the city because of wickedness. And for the world to be described as there was no one else around that was righteous except for Noah. For Noah to stand firm and still walk with God. I mean, we get down a little bit and we just want to give up on things sometimes. Noah, envisioning how bad things gotten in the first 6 chapters of the Bible, for God to want to destroy the earth and him still walk with God. That's such a lot.
Look at the people, the numerous people that are in our life who are faithful Christians trying to serve the Lord, and look at the state of the world that we're in. I mean, it's obviously it's not a great thing, but you just look at the general tenor of humanity, and there's this rejection of God, and this disbelief, and this every man's doing what's right according to his own eyes, and we can get discouraged because of that. And you look at Noah. I mean, it was him and his wife and his sons and their wives, and one of them, we're going to see questionable in his character a little bit later on. And yet this guy lived faithfully before the Lord, and it can be described in that way. It's truly an amazing thing. And I don't think it's for no reason at all. In the book of Ezekiel, he talks about, if 3 righteous men, and he says Daniel, Noah, and Job, there's 3 of the most righteous men. He said if they were here, they'd only save themselves by their own righteousness. So, yeah, that's an astounding statement to be made when you consider the context in the world in which Noah was living.
Stranger.
Generation. That's not a statement, I don't think, of his character in relation to the people that were around him. Let's say, well, he was better than the rest. No, he was. I think it's a superlative to the way he walked with God. He was blameless, even though everything around him was terrible.
Absolutely.
His bad company corrupts good morals. He really didn't have another option, and yet he still.
Yep. And I've wondered before, if everyone else was wicked, which that seems to be the case, how did Noah know to do good? Anyway, that's that we could get more into that. I do want to get into one of our discussion questions though, because this is I believe a lesson that's applicable for us, because as has been mentioned, we do live in a world where wickedness is pretty pervasive. And so, the question I wanted us thinking about is, there's actually 2 of them in there. One, how was he able to withstand conformity to the world? And so, thoughts and comments on that. Okay.
Maybe a lesson we need to do.
Okay. I think there's probably something to that. Paul warns about the dangers of idleness, doesn't he? Later on, and certainly he would have been working up to this point. But this is, he hadn't started building the ark yet. Once the ark project comes along, the next 100 years of his life, he's going to be too busy to get in too much trouble, isn't he? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's a good observation. Preached a sermon a long time ago on Mrs. Noah, and that's one of the things because nobody ever talks about Mrs. Noah, but we tried to give her a little bit of due. The fact that they raised 3 children that got on that ark, and that those 3 girls got on that ark, that says something about their influence among their children.
Explained the 120 years.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted to destroy men based off of their spiritual guidance. They were marrying because of their beauty and not because of their spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
No, probably married a pretty good woman.
Yeah.
So his wife, he did not go down that road.
Yep. I wish we knew more about her, but I think there's some things we can conclude just based off of her children. But obviously, she had to be on board with it, on board, you know, with everything, with that style of life as well. So, Billy?
He could not have done it without
Certainly, absolutely.
without a relationship with God. He had faith in God. He obviously talked to God through prayer. And without God's help, he would have probably never went to the world. But
Mm-hmm.
with God's help,
Yep. Yeah, and I think that takes us back to verse, what was it, verse 9, where it says Noah walked with God, and so that's that idea of relationship. And so communion with God and communication with God, those certainly had to be part of it. Yep. Good. Joel?
Narrows down to Abraham's family and works its way to Jesus. Because clearly there's things we don't know, right? We talked a couple weeks ago about the sacrifice with Cain and Abel. We don't know what the problem was.
Mhm.
Because clearly God had given him some direction.
Right.
Well, same thing here. You know, God's got a relationship with humanity at this point. Noah listened, everybody else didn't. Nineveh, who knows what the deal was, but Nineveh had the opportunity to repent and did, right? So, but I just think to me it's interesting that when you read the Bible, it's not an encyclopedia. It's it narrows pretty quickly, and it runs through the vein of Abraham's family to bring about
Mhm.
the Messiah. Because that's really
Yep.
involved.
Yeah, that's where this is going. Yeah. Andrew?
easy answer, but the right answer probably here is faith. Hebrews talks about that Noah, when he was warned about things not yet seen, in reverence, built the ark for the salvation of his household.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the world was flood at this time. We have no indication there was rain at this time. And so for him to do it in reverence, he never took it lightly. I'm sure he was serious about his work, getting it
Mhm.
done, while also preaching to those
Yeah.
around him. But his deep faith in God allowed him to do something that didn't make sense, you know, on the surface or by worldly wisdom. But he did it because he trusted in the one who entrusted him.
And that theme of faith, I mean, it runs throughout the entirety of Scripture. Every good example, that's what's going to be at the foundation of their life, is their faith in God to do that which is unseen and may not make much sense in the moment. Yep. Lauren?
The ark and talking about rain and flood and why he was building what God told him to do, and it's just that wasn't enough for some of us to give up because it's amazing the faith that we have in God.
You want to talk about something to discourage you, Noah preached for 100 years, didn't convert anybody. I guess it's something that he got his wife and his children and his daughter-in-laws on the ark. That's something. But, I mean, 100 years and nobody listens. And all the while he's building the ark, he's serving the Lord. His endurance had to be tremendous, that he just wasn't discouraged in the midst of all this. So, those are all good thoughts, comments. Tell you what, we're going to just go ahead and skip over that second question. I think most of us are probably familiar with that, and we can take and we can apply those principles, many of the things that were mentioned, into our life as well, seeing as we've got about 10 verses into chapter 6, and we've got about 2 more chapters to do. So this is, by the way, I'm teaching very fast, just so you know, through a text. I could spend probably, and I could easily spend one class on the first 4 verses. That's my methodology, but we're going according to this schedule, and so it's probably a good thing for me to be able to learn a change of pace and looking at things from a little bit bigger picture. Okay, moving on now. We see the seed of the serpent is multiplied, and I've mentioned this on a couple of times in previous classes, how we see the seed of the serpent and the seed of woman going all the way back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, and where you see this manifesting in various occasions. What seems to be the principal sin of the serpent's seed? We've seen it thus far, we see it here. It's violence, as I understand it. You think about Cain, he's clearly the seed of the serpent, and Abel's, his brother is righteous and he's wicked, okay? And so the violence that takes place there, you see Lamech, who comes from the seed of Cain, Okay, he's another manifestation of that. And what is he? He's bragging about the violence that he enacted on a man and his son. In John chapter 8 and verse 44, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees, the rulers that have rejected and opposed him, despite what they've seen, despite what they've heard, despite what they know. They should be able to recognize the Messiah. If anybody does, but they're ready to kill Jesus. And what does he say? You are of your father the devil. You're the seed of the serpent. Your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth. Okay, and so we see murder being one of the things. It's one of the principal sins that seems to be the seed of the serpent is involved in. And then you look at what's going on. Verse 13, behold, God's going to destroy the earth, for the earth is filled with violence. Okay, and so violence is one of the principal sins. There was a lot of wrong things going on, but violence was one of the principal sins that's taking place during the days of Noah that's causing God to respond to all of that with the near annihilation of humanity. So let's go on to get into question 3.
How specifically was Noah to build the ark, and why is that important?
Go for wood, all right.
15 wide, 30 tall, and it's designed that way so that it holds all the animals in there will stand on it.
Okay, yep. So good, concise answer. So the specifications there are given. It's obviously a very large vehicle. So, yes, ma'am?
The 300 cubits wide was 450 feet
Mhm.
wide.
Okay.
And 50 cubits is 85 feet in height and 25 feet in the window section.
Okay. All right. Yeah. 3 decks, I think. Thank you, Belinda. Yeah, cubit's a term most of us probably aren't familiar with, at least by the measurement that we use. But a cubit is 18 inch, about 18 inches they estimate, and there's a lot of different estimations, but I think the generally agreed upon estimation is that it's about 18 inches. So 1 cubit is about 1.5 feet. So thanks for those conversions there and helping us understand this. This is a monstrous project that Noah's working on. So you understand why God gave him 100 years to build it, right? It would have taken 100 years to have done all this. No. Can't imagine. You just think about the sheer determination and commitment Noah had, the faith that Noah has to do what God told him to do. Yes, sir. Yeah. You've seen that? Yeah. You can see that now. You think about one man and his family doing that? Yeah, it says he was preaching during that time. He's referred to as a preacher of righteousness, I think, in 2 Peter. So, yeah. I mean, good thing you can work and talk at the same time.
And about the measurements,
Mm-hmm.
from what I've read, we're still using the ratio thing.
Okay. That's interesting. That's an interesting observation. Question: If somebody else would have built a boat just like Noah's, would it have floated? Nah. All right. Would everybody have been saved on the boat? No. It wasn't the ingenuity of the ark. It wasn't the design of the ark. And we'll see a detail a little bit later on. I believe that if somebody else would have built an ark, it wouldn't have floated for that reason. It floated because God was involved in this, and God was going to save Noah. All right, verse 22, a key detail there. Noah did this, he did all that God had commanded him. So everything that God told him to do, he did it just like God told him to do it. There's a good lesson for us.
How many of the different kinds of animals was Noah commanded to take on the ark?
Okay. Yep. And that's clarified a little further
7
on.
pairs of
Yep.
clean and 7 pairs of birds.
All right, so clean animals he took 7 pairs, it would seem, and unclean animals he just took 1 pair. All right. So these are not only did he have to build the ark. I think I've thought about this before, but it kind of hit me as I was thinking through it again this time. He had to get food for all the animals. and food for his family. So not only is he building, he's also planting and storing and harvesting and trying to get those things watered, as however they did that back then. So you talk about a busy guy. Noah would have had his plate full. All right. In chapter 7, verse 4, we're told Noah was given a warning. He says 7 days you've got to get on the ark. So 7 more days to prepare, 7 more days to warn, 7 more days to invite. And finally the day arrives.
How many people were on the ark when the floods came upon the earth?
Estimates have been done as to how many people existed on the earth back then. And I mean, I've heard absurd numbers when you just look at one, and I think it's the lifespan of humanity that allowed it to be estimated so largely. I mean, 100 million to, I think, up to 1 billion, just when you look at the lifespan of how long people were living back then. I mean, 900 years. So just an absurd number of people. And out of all the people on the earth, 8 people get on. Can anyone think of a verse in the New Testament that tells us how many people got on the ark? Okay, yeah. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 20. We're familiar with verse 21, but 1 Peter 3:20 tells us 8 people were saved through water. And so that's just validating what we see here in Genesis. The reason I said, that this is, somebody could have built this identical ark just according to the same specifications that Noah built his, and it wouldn't have done any good, is when they board the ark in Genesis chapter 7 and verse 16, you have this statement made where it says, "And the Lord shut him in." That's why that ark floated. That's why Noah and his family were saved. He obeyed the Lord. He acted in faith. He got on the ark, and it wasn't the ingenuity and the design of the ark that saved them. It was God that saved them. I think it is. I think it's close. I don't, as far as, because there's, just the details are so scant, but I think it's built according to the length and the width and the height. So from my understanding, that's the case. Raise your hand if you've gone and seen the Ark Experience in Kentucky. That thing is tremendously huge, isn't it? And when you take a look at that, you understand how Noah was able to get all those animals in there. So, all right. The Lord shut them in. All right, let's summarize the events of the flood. What's that?
Is that, so many, and we refer to it as the story of the flood.
Mm-hmm.
And we really probably ought to be referring to it as the history, the account of the flood.
Yeah.
And the way people kind of portray the story of the flood, and it's just like a little ark. You got these animals poking their heads out of the ark. In reality, it's a big thing, and it was too very common. It was
Yeah, that's true. There's something to be said about that. You think about all of the subspecies that we have, and in our mind, that's just a tremendous number that couldn't fit on there. But you're right. It wasn't every single little subspecies. It wasn't every type of dog. It was dogs, right? It wasn't every type of cat. It was cats, so forth and so on. So not only that, but one of the things I thought that I didn't realize or didn't really think about there is some of the larger animals. Noah probably brought babies. So they'd be much smaller in size. They'd require much less food. They wouldn't take up near the room that a full-size animal would. And so it's probably, the young that came on the ark. So I'd not thought of that before until I went there. So I learned a lot of things there. So if you've not gone, it's definitely worth seeing. It's a faith-strengthening event from my experience, and I've heard several others say the same. All right, so the events of the flood, 40 days and 40 nights of rain. We're told in verses 19 and 20, this is chapter 7, by the way, that the mountains were covered by 15 cubits. Every creature in whose nostrils was the breath of life died. And in verse 24, the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days. Olin, do you have any thoughts on any of these you want to explore? Okay. I've got just one observation regarding the second one where we see the mountains were covered by 15 cubits. And then in verse 19 it says the whole heavens is made a statement there. There's a lot of speculation as to the nature of the flood. Those who look at the biblical events and try to reconcile them with with reality and say looking at this from a realistic perspective and the details. A lot of people want to say, well, the flood that occurred during the days of Noah was localized. That is, it was in one small area. It was in the part of the world that Noah lived in. And yes, there was a flood long ago, perhaps like the Bible tells, but it wasn't a global flood. But when I say, and I think what the Bible's communicating and wants us to understand is that it wasn't just a small area where Noah was at, but rather it was a worldwide flood. It was a global flood. And there's some really just pretty good evidence that reinforces the story that we read, the account that we read about here in Genesis. James Perloff, who's an author, says he analyzed more than 200 flood stories. And what's interesting is almost all civilizations have a flood story of some kind, and 95% of them mention a global deluge. And you just have to wonder, where did that come from? Why would nearly every society that exists come up with the same story in very similar? Now, granted, the minor details differ as you go from place to place and group to group. But the one thing that they do all have in common, just about, is a global deluge. You also have marine animals on mountains and fossils that have been found there. You've got what are called worldwide fossil graveyards that contain mixed species of both land animals and sea animals. You've got human and I found this was interesting when I was looking into this. Human and animal DNA shows signs of bottlenecks, which supports the idea of a massive ancient population reduction. And what that essentially means is it seems like in somewhat recent times within humanity and animals that they go back to a certain time and they kind of bottleneck, meaning all of the humans or all of the animals that come forth from this point in time came from this bottleneck where there was this massive reduction in population of both animals and humans. And that really, while it doesn't substantiate anything, it does seem to give good evidence that strengthens the flood narrative when you look at how all of humanity was destroyed and so much of the animals were. Dennis? Really? I mean, they had to get up there somehow, right? And you see that. I mean, you see that in there were 3 or 4 mountain ranges, the Andes, the Alps, and another one that I came across that have sea animals. I mean, up fossilized up there, tens of thousands of feet up these mountains. And so, at some point in time, they had to get up there somehow. And so, this it just, to me, and it corroborates and it fits what we read about here in Genesis, where God sent a global flood throughout all of the world. It's hard to imagine how else they would have gotten up there. Joel? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's an image of judgment and the degree of violence that would have come with,
Mm-hmm.
with explosions of the ocean. So that's really compelling to me, that just the level of violence that would have been involved in this
Mm-hmm.
flood. But then, some years ago, we went out to took a flood tour, even in Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
And the guy would show these places where there's these uniform sedimentary levels
Yeah.
all over the world at the same
Mhm.
elevation level. And then he pointed at landscape design. There's things that involve landscape design that don't make any sense geologically
Mhm.
where they are. Erosion doesn't explain it. Nothing else explains it. The only thing that really explains it is this
Cataclysmic flood event.
world event that changed.
I'm glad you mentioned that because I saw that, but I didn't think I was smart enough to explain it. So I'm glad that you were able to bring that out. Yeah, that's one of the evidences I saw that seemed to support a global flood. So, good observation there. Question 7.
How was Noah able to determine the flood had ended in Genesis 8, 6 through 12?
Okay. Send out the birdies. So he sends out a raven. It doesn't come back. It's a carnivore. so it could obviously feast on the carrion floating about. Sends out a dove, comes back, sends it out again, brings back an olive leaf, sends it out again, and it doesn't come back. And so he was able to determine through that process that the flood waters had subsided. So let me just answer this one real quick. After exiting the ark, he builds an altar, and it pleases the Lord, and the smell goes up, and God is going to proceed in making a covenant with all creation. So I know we ran through chapter 8. Thankfully, this is a text we're pretty familiar with, but let's spend the rest of our time in chapter 9.
How did life on earth change after the flood?
Okay, so a couple of things. Fear of man is instilled in animals, and so it seems before the flood that wasn't the case. Animals are given to man for food, with the stipulation given that flesh is not to be eaten raw. Did you have any comments on any of chapter 9, Olin?
Yeah, capital punishment, which, yeah, that's this one. Why did God instate the law of capital punishment? I feel like there's some,
Preventing people.
So this never happens again, right?
yes, yeah.
Yeah. And if you look at fundamentally what's wrong with taking the life of another person, it's that man is made in the image of God.
Yes, sir.
All right.
What was the covenant that God made with Noah, and what was the sign?
All right.
And part of that too is, hey, these seasons and things,
Mm.
don't earthly could interrupt that middle.
All right. Have anything you want to jump out at chapter 9 for you, Olin?
Well, the last discussion question,
Okay.
what does the flood and the ark symbolically represent in the New Testament?
Okay. I think judgment's one of them. Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 24. He makes a reference to, as in the days of Noah. I think there's an immediate application to the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to occur. And I think he also uses it to point to a greater worldwide cataclysmic event that's going to come upon humanity because of sin. And that's the ultimate judgment day when the earth will never be destroyed again with water. Peter tells us how it's going to be destroyed again next time. It's going to be with fire, okay, in which we'll, that's judgment that's going to befall upon all humanity. And the ark, the waters, what does it represent? 1 Peter 3. Yep, it's the means by which we find safety. Not the water in and of itself, but that is the means through which we are brought into Christ. We are aboard the ark, if you will, symbolically, and where we are preserved from judgment when it falls on the earth. So Jesus helps us understand the flood as a picture of judgment that's going to come, and Peter helps us understand that baptism is a picture of the water through which we're brought to safely through judgment.
It's sort of a sub-story, but after they come out of the ark and they're given meat to eat, but
Mhm.
God says, well, don't eat the blood.
Yeah.
And then there's this really profound biblical language. And we know the rest of the story.
Yep.
The control of Jesus, the lights in the blood.
Yeah, that's kind of a layered statement, for the Jews that would have first heard this. Okay, their thinking is Leviticus, sacrifices. Those were things that were incorporated by all the pagan nations in their worship of their false gods. That's something that God forbids. Okay, and so the blood was given as an atonement, as a covering for sin. That's how they worshiped God and how sins were forgiven during that period of time, during that dispensation. But ultimately, that the life that comes through the blood that Jesus was going to shed on the cross for the sins of the world. So yeah, that's kind of a layered statement, and you could probably even expound on it beyond that. But those are immediate applications for them were the sacrifices that were being offered and the blood offerings that were given. They weren't to eat flesh with blood in it. And then pointing ultimately to Jesus and his blood that was shed that saves us from our sin. All right, so thank you for your participation in our class tonight. Handouts for Lesson 5, grab those, and we'll be going through the scattering of the people Sunday night.